Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Nandini, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for this year. Just yesterday, The Guardian reported that Trump has captured the Republican Party. This was meant to be good news for President Biden because the source reported that Trump is only interested in appealing to his base, leaving the larger public square to moderate Democrats. However, USA Today also reported yesterday that the Republican Civil War was over 5 years ago. Trump has a new target, the larger American population. On one hand, the media is telling the public that Trump is satisfied with his base. On the other, it is telling us that Trump is ready to expand his base. So what are the Republican Party's plans? Can the GOP be separated from Trump, or has it, once and for all, been co-opted by bigotry and white grievances? CMC Associate Professor of Government Jon Shields is here tonight to moderate a panel with Oren Cass, Mona Charen, and John Wood Jr. on the future of the Republican Party. Oren Cass is the Executive Director of American Compass, an organization whose mission is to restore an economic orthodoxy that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. From 2015 to 2019, Cass was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where his work on strengthening the labor market addressed issues ranging from the social safety net and environmental regulation to trade and immigration. Mona Charen is a columnist, journalist, and political commentator, having received her bachelor's with honors from Barnard College and JD degree from the George Washington University Law School. She has written several books, including Useful Idiots: How Liberals Got It Wrong in the Cold War and Still Blame America First. John Wood Jr. is the former vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County and a noted writer and speaker on subjects including racial and political reconciliation. Wood is also a national leader for Braver Angels, a citizens organization uniting red and blue Americans in a working alliance to depolarize America. The panel will present for 35 minutes before taking questions from the audience. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send in questions, please state your affiliation with the college. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Oren Cass, Mona Charen, John Wood Jr., and Professor Shields to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you for the introducing our panelists so beautifully. I'm Jon Shields. It's a delight to be moderating this event this evening. I want to extend a really warm welcome to all our viewers, but especially to our panelists. And I particularly want to thank our panelists who are joining us from the East Coast. I'm mindful of the fact that we're just blowing through your cocktail hours here. And so thank you for joining us. We're here tonight to talk about the future of the Republican Party. And I guess really just to begin thinking about this question, I'd like each of you to reflect on the current place of Trump in the Republican Party. You know, is he really, to what degree is he really the leader of the Republican Party? How strong is his grip on the party's loyalties and agenda? And to get us started, I think I'd kick this first to Mona. Mona, what's your sense of Trump's place now in the GOP?
Thank you. I'd also just like to thank you all for having me, and thanks to the students. I'm sorry that it has to be virtual. I always love meeting students in person. It's kind of invigorating, but this will have to do for now. So I think the Republican Party has been completely captured by Donald Trump. I think this was clear in 2016, and it has only been strengthened in the interim. I'll give you just a couple of data points. In the long, 150-year history of the Republican Party, through Civil War and Depression and World Wars, every 4 years without fail, the Republican Party produced a party platform at its convention, except this year. In 2020, the party platform said, whatever Donald Trump is for, that's what we're for. That was it. It was a single page. And they blamed the pandemic, but of course, the Democratic Party was able to come up with a platform despite the fact of the pandemic. It would not have been difficult. So that is the nature of the party. And there was a brief moment after the January 6th insurrection, where it seemed that the spell might be broken, and when leaders of the party might finally be ready to break with him. It looked like Lindsey Graham was doing so on the floor of the Senate. It seemed that that Mitch McConnell was ready to vote to impeach him. The Wall Street Journal editorial page said he should be impeached and removed immediately, though the Journal had been quite sympathetic to Trump throughout his presidency, and on and on. And yet, within a few weeks, the party and all of the regulars sort of trooped down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring and to reinforce what some of us feared, which is that despite everything, despite having committed the worst offense against our democratic order in 2 centuries, the party remains firmly in Trump's grip.
John, do you agree with this assessment? So Mona says it's been completely captured. What's your sense?
Well, I think that the simple headline is that it is Donald Trump's party for now. And I think that what we witnessed was a sort of momentary shaking loose of some people's commitments to President Trump's political fortunes as being tied to that of the party and the conservative movement, because one, I think that there was a genuine shock at what transpired on the 6th. And even if a person doesn't say that President Trump directly incited that as an intentional matter, it's certainly at the very least, I think, the case that the environment, the raucous environment set not just on that day, but across the entire course of President Trump's presidency, and really just sort of career prior to that, invited the sorts of personalities and outpourings that we witnessed on the 6th. And Trump's not the only person to stir the cauldron, but he's at the top of that list. This is a phenomenon of his era. And yet, stepping out of office, it is clear that President Trump maintains the loyalty of the base of the party in a firm and passionate way, and therefore is able to hold the sword of Damocles, if you will, over the political fortunes of the vast majority of elected Republicans. Now, having said that, it's clear that there are islands of resistance. You have Mitt Romney, you have Liz Cheney, you have groups outside of office in different sectors of society who are defiant of that hegemony. But what I think ultimately must be the case is that there must be a desire for a flavor of conservatism, for a deeper spirit of conservatism, and a forward-looking politics that can summon some aspirational vision in terms of what we want to be as a country that can be serviced by a conservatism rooted in some idealism that goes beyond the personal interests of one man's ego or beyond the grievances that, for better or worse, so many of us feel within the conservative movement towards our political opponents. Something that can raise America's gaze towards a future that is not necessarily promised by the Democratic Party right now, but that is utterly sort of looked away from in any higher sort of way by the brand of republicanism that Donald Trump represents. The question is, what is that forward vision going to look like? And how can that connect with a conservative base and a larger American mainstream that I think is, broadly speaking, dissatisfied with politics on both sides of the aisle, but that is split according to the tribal lines that President Trump has it as his legacy, as reinforcing both during his presidency and now as he pivots into his post-presidential years.
Thanks, John. And Oren, is your take somewhat different from John's or Mona's? How do you see this question?
I suppose my take's a little bit different. There's nothing either of them said that I would point to and say, well, that's wrong. That's completely out there. But I think where I would be a little bit more skeptical of the degree to which it's his party is just to say, with respect that we don't know, that everything about the Trump phenomenon since he ran for office, how he behaved in office, has obviously been very unique, and attempts to sort of project based on prior figures did not get us very far. And I think his post-presidency is going to be the same. I mean, we know how most ex-presidents behave, and I think it's safe to say we don't think Trump is going to behave that way. But we don't actually know what happens when an ex-president, particularly one who loses, goes out not only sort of personally losing, but with January 6th, also losing the House, frankly, being quite directly responsible for losing a Senate that the party never should have lost, losing his social media platforms in the process, and losing the ability to command national media coverage the way he did when he was in fact the nominee or the president. I think we just don't know how that's going to play out. If he were someone of great personal energy and organizing capacity, and you imagined him kind of, barnstorming the country or building an incredible organizing function, that would be one way that you could see him really extending his influence. But he doesn't seem likely to do either of those. In fact, I think it's quite notable that since the inauguration, we essentially have not heard from him, except for at CPAC. And so, if he wanted to be out there, he could be, but he's not. And so I think certainly today you would say, well, obviously he's by far the most prominent and beloved figure among Republicans, but it's not as if his approval when he was in office among Republicans was higher than what you would typically see for a president, for a sitting president with his own party. It was exactly the sort of allegiance you'd expect. And so I think the big question over the next 2 years is twofold. It's one, what does he do to actually stay front and center, and is he able to do that successfully? And two, who else emerges? Because one, if you look at the CPAC poll, for instance, there are two ways to read it. I think he got 55%. And one way you could say, well, he got 55%, right? He got like 50% more than anybody else. But the other way to look at it would be he only got 55%. And at the point where it's, he's still on the scene and there are one or two people who are clearly emerging as the other most prominent leaders, I think things will be different as well. So in my mind, I think we're going to learn a lot during the 2022 primaries, where he is obviously planning to stake his reputation on primarying some frankly quite popular Republicans on no basis except his personal dislike for them. And if he succeeds, then you can expect a lot of people to fall in line. If he fails, I think you'll see a lot of people feeling like he is an ex-president like all the other ex-presidents.
Yeah, so Mona, how would you respond to Jon and Oren? I mean, Jon's pointing out that there are these islands of opposition. Maybe, isn't it possible that the Republican Party becomes more factionalized and divided? You see this in, say, the House votes, over whether to certify over impeachment, for example, or Oren's sort of sense that there's a lot of uncertainty here, and he's sort of the nominal leader right now, but it's early, and so.
Well, in response to Jon, I would say they're the loneliest little islands. We're not even talking about an archipelago. I mean, it's just a few little dots out in the ocean. Romney and Cheney and, a few others, maybe Larry Hogan a little, but really they're very lonely. Of course, it's early days, and I agree with Oren that, we don't really know how things are going to play out, but I would say, based on our recent experience, that the loyalty of the Republican Party to Donald Trump has been unlike anything I have ever seen in politics. It is not like the loyalty to other political figures. It is cult-like. And you saw, for example, that those Republican office holders who were brave enough to vote for impeachment or to convict were immediately sanctioned by their home state Republican committees. The sort of iron grip that Trump has on the party is very strong. Oren said he hasn't really been heard from, and that's right. I mean, he's off Twitter and so forth. Nevertheless, despite that, despite having lost his megaphone, you saw Kevin McCarthy, who on the day after January 6th had said that the president was responsible for what happened. You saw him traipsing down to Mar-a-Lago to make amends. You saw Nikki Haley, who also had a few critical things to say. She too sought to mend fences with Trump. This is without Trump really lifting a finger. And you saw, perhaps most disappointingly, Mitch McConnell, who gave I think it was cowardly of him not to vote to convict, but at least he did give a speech after the vote, very clearly laying out Trump's moral and political and every other kind of responsibility for what had happened, for spreading the lies and encouraging the radicalism of his followers, the violence of his followers, and so forth. He did that after the impeachment vote, and then just last week asked on television whether, if that man who he says was responsible for the most terrible attack on the American government ever, if he's the nominee of the Republican Party in 2024, whether McConnell would support him, and he said absolutely.
So can I jump in on something on that? Well, I thought it was fine that the way Mona said that the support is cult-like and sort of totally unlike what we've ever seen in American politics. I guess I would say almost the opposite, which is that the behavior of everyone else in this picture is exactly what we've always seen in American politics. What's different is Donald Trump. That is, you have a very normal set of political actors trying to react to a very abnormal outlier. But they are doing so essentially exactly how you would expect them to behave if they just chose to treat him not like an abnormal outlier. That is, everybody else is essentially, and you could say, well, I would expect elected politicians to behave differently given how extraordinary Donald Trump is, but I don't know that it's extraordinary that they've chosen not to behave differently. When the leader of Republicans in the Senate says, yes, if that person is the Republican nominee in 2024, I will support him, there's a way in which that's extraordinary and cult-like. There's also a way in which that's exactly what the leader of either party in the Senate would have said at every point in the last 240 years. And so I think if you view it through that lens, I think maybe it's not as abnormal. Really, the abnormal thing we've seen is you had a not insignificant number of people at the president's own party voting to impeach and convict, which had never happened in American history.
John, I know you want to get in here. How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Oren is right in the sense that there is an effort on the part of elected Republicans to, in a sense, interact with President Trump, former President Trump, as if he were sort of a more normal figure, in part because the incentive, the interest, is to be able to maintain the functionality, the functioning unity so much as it were possible of the Republican Party so that it can continue to compete, and even if it is captained by an individual who folks regard as dangerous or damaging in however many ways, Mitch McConnell, being an institutionalist, being somebody who, as an institutionalist, had incredibly wise and profound admonitions to give to the president and to others, or having set the stage for January 6th, nevertheless finds himself, I think, institutionally bound to the fate of the party and therefore the fortunes of whoever the party chooses, even if he finds himself morally at odds with that individual. So that's elected officials. I think that Mona's point, I'm guessing, has more to do with the base of Trump's support, more to do with the ordinary Americans who frankly love Donald Trump. And they love Donald Trump because they feel, among other reasons, but because they feel that Donald Trump genuinely loves them. And so when we ask this question, how is it that, or is it possibly the case that there could be some effective challenging of President Trump's hedge money within the party, it has to zero in on this question. And it's a question that goes beyond mere policy or the prospective political fortunes of the Republican Party. There has to be a movement within the Republican Party or a shift in the conservative movement that rejects the essential moral relativism of of Donald Trump's political approach, political philosophy, or lack thereof in any morally grounded sort of way, but that nevertheless carries with it a degree of empathy and understanding for the people that President Trump appeals to that was not necessarily present in the campaigns of previous Republican presidential nominees, including men that I admire greatly. There has been a divide in the Republican Party and the conservative movement between the so-called establishment of the Republican Party and the base of the GOP that Donald Trump exploited in a visceral way because he could connect to people who nobler individuals were not able to. And many other things are implied by that fact. And so that's where I tend to put my attention with respect to this question.
Mona, do you want to push back either against Oren or John? Or I'm happy to reframe this a little too, but I want to give you a shot.
So it's something that we've been thinking about, writing about now for many years since Trump came on the scene. The one interpretation of his popularity is that he speaks for sort of the white working class whose welfare has been neglected by the so-called Republican establishment, and therefore through Trump's trade and immigration appeals, he was appealing to this constituency that had been neglected. There's another interpretation that he appealed to people's racial, ethnic, and other fears and hatreds, like a demagogue, and that's the source of his appeal. I don't think that we will ever know for sure, because you cannot, you cannot interrogate tens of millions of people and find out what's motivating them. But I think the case that he was appealing, that his message was mostly one of economics and of closing factories and that sort of thing, and trade and immigration. I'm skeptical that that was really the source of a lot of his popularity. May have been some, but he governed as a plutocrat. He gave huge tax cuts to wealthy people. He did he did the bidding basically of the business class in the Republican Party. He didn't govern as a populist, and nevertheless, his appeal is undiminished among the base of the Republican Party. So I think it was not the economic appeal so much as it was the sense that he hates the people that they hate and fear, and that he's not afraid to say it. And a lot of Trump supporters would say, he says what we think. And I do think that those who say the cruelty is part of the point are right. When you listened, for example, to his CPAC speech just a few days ago, the things that really got the crowd going were not the economic arguments and the recitation of his so-called accomplishments as president, but the personal insults and the lies about the election. That was the thing that really got the crowd excited. So that's one little, that's one report from the front. And as I say, you could not interrogate tens of millions of people, but I'm skeptical that the economic argument is the real source of his appeal.
So Oren, I want to pull you in here because I take it you've got a different take on this. You have a sense that Trump did raise some important and neglected sort of issues that I think John is pointing to as well, and that the party might have a sort of bright post-Trump future, a future that is more multi-ethnic, that is more of a workers' party, and so I would like you to flesh that view out a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I take issue with the idea that there's some kind of clear dichotomy between economic issues and cultural issues, and people are sort of either, voting on Section 2 whatever tariff rates, or else are just racist, which is a slight overstatement of what Mona said, but I'm not sure how much.
I didn't say that.
It seems to me that more in keeping with I would identify with what Jon said, that Trump's appeal is in taking on a set of issues and working from a set of assumptions that resonated with a lot of voters who felt like they'd been overlooked. And it's not just the white working class. In fact, Trump didn't do any better with white voters than Romney did. Trump did better already in 2016 with non-white voters. And then in 2020, he did better with non-white voters than any Republican since either Ford or Nixon, I believe. And so I think it's very difficult, if you're talking about reports from the front, to square that with the idea that what he's really kind of going after is a racist or anti-immigrant message per se. Where I see him speaking very differently than other Republicans had, partly, and I take this to be Jon's point, I think just the cultural touch points and the tone and the where he was willing to assign respect sort of connected with a lot of people in a way that the establishment figures who frankly tended not to seem to like or want to be around a lot of the voters probably didn't. But I think there is an important economic element to the critique, which is that the right of center and frankly the mainstream Democratic view in recent decades had basically been this model that we're just going to pursue economic growth as fast as we can. Growth is good. We're going to do that through globalization. Disruption is great. If there are no jobs where you are, move somewhere else. And that's going to leave a lot of people behind, and we're going to have safety net programs for them. And I think very differently from pretty much everybody else up there on that stage in 2016 on both the Republican and the Democratic side, Trump said that's not what's important, and the place where you're from, the sort of identity that you have and the way you think about the culture of your community and your identity as a worker and caring about the job you have, not the idea of just GDP growth going up or the stock market going up and that eventually leads to jobs, that those are the things that matter and that he's going to talk about. And so talking about issues like, say, trade and immigration the way he did, I don't think they were signals that, my wonky trade and immigration white paper is the best one, but nor do I think they were signals that, foreigners are bad people. I think they were signals that this set of assumptions that we should just pursue a kind of very globalist agenda and somehow bail out the people left behind isn't what people were looking for. And that he brought a very different message that I think that connected with a lot of people who felt like they'd been ignored.
Okay, I want to jump in. Can I jump in, Jon? Is that okay? Because I have a question for Oren.
Sure.
So the nature of that appeal, the way you described it, it sounds so benign. But in fact, that is not the way he presented his arguments. He didn't say, look, we need to take account of, the needs of this particular group that has been neglected. No, his appeal, and I am asking you whether you would agree with this, okay? His appeal struck me as complete demagoguery. He said, the Mexicans are not sending us their best. They're sending us rapists. Some of them may be all right, but they're sending us their worst people. They're rapists, they're criminals. Regarding Americans who had ancestry from other places, he said so-called judges or Mexican judges. Regarding one more example, he claimed many times in speeches that he had witnessed Arab Americans celebrating, dancing in the streets after 9/11. Okay? And this was a lie. This never happened. That is the kind of lie, when you tell it about a minority group and you are an influential person, that is incredibly dangerous and incendiary. Agree or disagree?
That kind of lie is dangerous and incendiary? Yeah, I agree with that, sure.
Okay. So when I just bring this up because the way you describe his appeal is so sanitized. I mean, it was a vicious appeal. It was an appeal to people's fears, to make them hate certain people, right?
So, John, I know you want to get in here, and I want you to respond, but I also want you to, you're someone who's, I want you to reflect on the sort of the prospects of the GOP reaching a broader sort of multiracial group of citizens. And I ask you partly because you're someone who's tried to do this, right? You were a Republican who ran against Maxine Waters. So maybe you can respond to this feud, but also speak to that larger question.
Sure. I mean, one thing I would add to the conversation in motion right here is that, you know, part of the perhaps, you know, morally neutral art of politics is the practice of being able to say one thing that is interpreted in different but all beneficial ways for the person saying that thing by the different parties to whom he or she is speaking. When Donald Trump, I think, says something like, Mexico's not sending us their best, they're sending us, you know, criminals, rapists, and some are fine people. That is a phrase that will land on some people who love Trump and find itself passing through a filter within which what they hear, what they take into themselves, I think, is a statement of, well, look, obviously Mexico is sending us a bunch of criminals. This is a big problem. We know that people are being killed on the border in inner cities. We know they're bringing drugs, but he's not saying that all Mexicans are bad. He said it himself. He said some are fine people. He's just talking about that one group, and we want border security. That appeals to us. That same phrase lands on somebody else who hears that and thinks to him or herself, Donald Trump knows the truth. These people are a big problem. And as a general matter, you know, the culture that they're bringing is something that we don't want. And I think that in part of what made Donald Trump such an effective communicator is the fact that he's a salesman before he's a politician, right? And part of what folks in sales, and I come from sales originally, have an understanding of that folks in politics sometimes do not, is that fear and love can motivate us simultaneously, you know. And Trump was a master at hitting the emotional and psychological touch points of people, both on the level of capitalizing on their fears, but also on the level of giving them someone whom they could touch, someone they could feel, someone they felt would be a champion for them in a close and personal way. And so his impact on people psychologically is profound. So the second part of your question to me, John, was how is it that the GOP can expand its reach? And you mentioned my campaign for Congress, so on and so forth. The Republican Party has struggled to speak a human language for a long time. And it just goes to Oren's earlier points about how, you know, people don't generally vote on the finer bullet points of policy proposals. But to Oren, and I think, you know, Mona's understanding, there is, well, let me just speak for myself. There is a relationship between policy and the cultural signals that we send. I think that a policy platform that emphasizes economic opportunity, the ability of workers to be able to provide for themselves, their family, the dignity of work, some of the mainstays of conservative economic thinking remain pillars that ought not be abandoned. But we need to communicate and we need to honestly feel within ourselves a deep commitment to telling the story of the different groups of the American people, starting with the conservative base that right now feels that only Donald Trump understands them and their struggles. So long as we are not able to tell the stories of working class white folks alongside the struggles of people of color, African Americans, Latinos, and other immigrants, people in the LGBTQ community, as long as we're not able to be in dialogue with the lived experience, pardon the phrase, I know folks don't like it, but as long as we're not able to be in dialogue with the lived experiences of the different parts of the American family, and starting with, if this is a struggle for the soul of the Republican Party, those folks to whom Donald Trump has deep and intense appeal, then we will never be able to win the trust of the folks, of the communities that anchor the political fortunes of the GOP. But it is possible to be able to tell those stories and to be in dialogue with them. So, I think that's where the intention has to turn.
Oren, did you want to respond? I know that Mona wants to get in here too, but I think.
No, I think I generally agree with the way that Jon was framing it, and I think Mona's certainly right about some of the specific disgusting things that Donald Trump said. I remember back in 2016 going through them chapter and verse. There were plenty of terrible things he did in office as well. I think the question is, no, you can't interrogate tens of millions of people, but you have to, in a sense, to have this kind of conversation, have some sort of perspective on what you think is motivating them. And it seems to me that you can either start from a perspective that, most Americans are people of good faith who, just like the rest of us, care about their families and their communities and their livelihoods and generally want good things for themselves and those around them. Or you can start from some more kind of Hillary Clinton basket of deplorables kind of framing, that a significant share of the population is just sort of lost to us and motivated by the wrong things. And I reject that second explanation. I don't think there's evidence for it. I think you can look back previously and say, don't forget, this is the same Republican base that chose Mitt Romney in 2012 and John McCain in 2008 and George W. Bush 2 times before that. I mean, at the end of the day, these are the same Americans by and large, not to mention that Trump's margin was a group of people that had voted for Barack Obama previously, right? By definition. And as we've seen, there was obvious appeal to a segment of the non-white electorate. And so I think it's really important as we have these conversations to recognize that people's motivations are complex and the behavior of politicians hits them at various emotional and psychological as well as intellectual levels. And we can certainly condemn the individual things a politician says. They're responsible for those things. But to take somebody who on the totality of circumstances decides, in particular, well, I was a Barack Obama voter, but I like what Donald Trump is saying, and assume that it's because of kind of the most disgusting things he said. I don't think that's an especially supportable way to analyze the electorate.
Look, leadership matters. You say it's the same voters who chose to nominate Mitt Romney and so on. What leaders do changes the people, and that is part of what we have seen. The people have changed. Some 30% of Republicans now say that they think that the essence of the QAnon conspiracy is probably true. The QAnon conspiracy is the most ludicrous, sinister, crazy idea that a cabal of Democrats and Hollywood elites are running a huge cannibalistic child abuse ring, and that Donald Trump is secretly at war with them and will at some point arrest them all, and there will be mass hangings and so forth. 30% of the Republicans in a poll said they think there's truth to that. You find that huge percentages of the Republican electorate now, upwards of 70% and 80% in some polls, believe that the last election was not free and fair. That's a lie. And it's a very destructive lie because it goes to the heart of our democratic order. If you undermine faith in our elections, as Donald Trump did, you have invited the whirlwind, because as we saw on January 6th, when people believe that their vote has been stolen from them, that their country has been stolen from them illegitimately, and that it wasn't a free and fair election where Biden deserves to take office, of course, they're going to turn to violence. And I don't think we've seen the end of it for as long as Donald Trump and his acolytes remain the opinion shapers on the right, along with Fox News and the other outlets of right-wing opinion and information, you are undermining the essence of our democratic system. And all of these discussions about, well, Trump, sort of identified something in the white working class. Who cares? That's all that is so minor compared to what we are now facing with the destruction that has been wrought by this president and his party, by the whole Republican Party, for failing to stand up to him and stand up for American values.
But Mona, are you saying that there is a contradiction between recognizing, and I do recognize it, recognizing the destructive nature of these claims and the cynicism with which they were pursued? Are you saying there's a contradiction between recognizing that on the other hand, but also asserting on the other that we nevertheless have to viscerally reconnect with the base of voters that President Trump rests his own power and influence upon if we are going to rechart a path or chart a new path for the Republican Party and the conservative movement going forward?
Look, I was part of a group called the Reformicons a few years back who were proposing all kinds of policy approaches that would get the Republican Party out of the rut that it had fallen into in the post-Reagan era, where a lot of the policy proposals we thought were kind of stale, weren't getting to where people's real lives were being lived. So I believe in trying to reach the voters and trying to do what's best for people and trying to, think anew about new problems in a new age. What I do not think is the solution is to support someone who tears the country apart with every word that comes out of his lips.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I certainly agree with that. But the question in my mind is, can we do both of those things at the same time? And I think that is the imperative.
Yeah, well, I don't think any of us are saying we support Donald Trump or the way he's being behaved. I mean, I would ask John's question a little bit more bluntly of Mona and just, I can't directly ask the audience, but it's worth thinking about. Just, do you agree with Hillary Clinton's statement? I mean, Clinton said you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, the racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And I think that is a fundamentally incorrect, it is factually wrong, and it is also a very dangerous way to think and talk about our democracy.
So so is the poll that just came out that appeared in today's Washington Post that said 70% of Trump supporters, and Trump supporters are about half the Republican Party, strong Trump supporters, 70% not only want him to have another term, but they want him to continue to serve after that. So what do you say about that? That is kind of anti-democratic, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
so I'm not going to worry too much about one line from Hillary Clinton when what we're facing is a party and a former president who are trying to destroy the essence of our democratic system.
Okay.
Hillary should not have said that. Right. That's true.
Okay, great spirited conversation. I want to pivot us because I know that there's a lot of questions out there for you folks. And so we can continue these disagreements maybe in and through the Q&A. So I think I'm going to hand it over to some of the Ath Fellows here now to manage the second frame of our evening together.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for the spirited discussion. So the first question I have to ask comes from an alum that asks 60 to 70% of Republican voters are reported to be in favor of President Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package, but 100% of the House Republicans voted against it. To what extent will disconnects like this one impact the Republican electorate in 2022?
Anyone want to field that one?
Well, I think it's certainly a big problem for the Republican Party that the essentially set of elected officials that we still have in Congress, by and large, are not advancing a sort of agenda that is likely to be very popular. I think there are a lot of things wrong with the $1.9 trillion relief bill, but there are parts of it that are important and useful as well. And so I think what is incumbent on Republicans is to actually have an affirmative agenda that they're putting out there that is going to appeal to voters. And we obviously haven't talked much about policy in the context of Trump, because that's not an area he was leading on. But it is certainly going to be a big variable for what the Republican Party is able to do.
Unfortunately, the Republican Party is no longer, because of the Trump influence, is no longer able to make these kinds of principled cases against something like the Biden $1.6 trillion stimulus. It's unfortunate because there are some things in the bill that are fine, but many things that are overdone. And Romney had some very good critiques, for example, and there are many people who have, but there are a few problems. And one of them is that that Republicans have lost the moral high ground to say that they're worried about overspending because of the huge deficits that were run up under Trump. And now Democrats who are inclined to be big spenders are going to say, well, sorry, you did it, and you did it for the rich, and now we're going to do it for our people. That's the way they're going to frame the argument. And unfortunately, Republicans opened the door to that.
I don't think that it's going to be helpful, but I also don't think it's going to be decisive in either direction. From what I understand, I think that majorities of Republican voters have actually supported, or at least in years past, had actually supported raising taxes on the top, single percentage point of income earners. It never stopped Republican politicians from running on that as a part of their platform and winning. I think the question is always, how does policy sit in the context of the larger social and cultural arguments that particularly presidents and presidential candidates and national political figures make, although not limited to them even. So it's an important issue. I don't think it helps the GOP by any means, but I doubt it'll be decisive one way or the other.
If President Trump isn't the right guy for the Republican Party moving forward, how should we proceed to get the right candidate in place? Can you name 3 potential new leaders of the GOP?
That's a good question.
I mean, I can name people that I like in various different ways and to certain degrees. I mean, I like Dan Crenshaw in a lot of different ways. I'm sure I have issues with him. Part of the problem is that some of the folks I like the most can't be the future. Mitt Romney can't be the future of the Republican Party, but he can help hold a place today, right? No, I think the issue is it's got to be less about identifying individual personalities and more about stirring some genuine cultural and philosophical revival within the Republican Party and the conservative movement. I mean, one thing you can say about the Democratic Party and the progressive movement is that even if you don't like the idea set that's in vogue in the social justice left and within the space of anti-racism and so on and so forth, there is energy in embracing a new analysis of the character of American life, which is capturing the imaginations of a new generation of young people. The only thing that seems to be capturing the imagination of people on the right now seems to be the personality of Donald Trump, for better or for worse. And so I think we have to look within a little bit and come to grips with what is it on a positive dimension that would make us want to be conservative to begin with, beyond just opposition to the Democratic Party, so on and so forth. And I think part of it, for me at least, has to be a recognition of the fact that there have to be guardians of the integrity of our institutional life and the virtues that go into informing a citizenship that allows for all people to flourish in the context of democracy. And that has to be something within which Black and white and left and right and all manners of the American people have an opportunity to reach their full potential while not glossing over their struggles and their pains and their histories. And that's a complicated thing to work into a modern conservative platform. But the conservative engagement with the mainstream of American multicultural and cross-class societal existence is long overdue. And it may be that the opportunity to engage that conversation, that cultural conversation properly, is upon us.
Oren or Mona, what do you think?
I think until the Republican Party can rid itself of Trumpism, it absolutely cannot be allowed to hold power, period.
Are there any candidates, I'm curious, Mona, that capture some of Trump's economic nationalism or sort of broadly policy agenda that you think could steer the party and unite it in a way that, never Trumpers like yourself would find appealing?
It would require an acknowledgement that the big lie was just that, a lie about the stolen election. It would require acknowledging that the 2/3 of the House Republican caucus who voted not to certify the election of Joe Biden were acting in an illegitimate and undemocratic fashion. And once we get past that, and once the apologies are proffered and the recognition is made that that was a dangerous and terrible moment in American history, then they can begin to talk about anything else that they want, and I'll be happy to listen. And I think voters would be happy to listen, but not until we clear the decks.
So what do you think, Oren? Must there be a kind of reckoning in this way? And are there the candidates that can do what Jon has just laid out for us here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few promising candidates. I think in the Senate, Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton are particularly notable, as is Mitt Romney, who is not likely to be a future presidential candidate, but not every kind of senior leader in a party has to be running for the White House at all times. And, you see, I think both in the COVID relief efforts last year and now in some of the debates this year, that exact group really driving the Republican agenda. Marco Rubio was behind the whole payroll protection program, which was, I think, the largest and most successful part of the COVID relief package. Cotton and Romney were the leaders on the direct payments to families, and actually introduced that from the Republican side before the Democrats had proposed it, I believe. And now this time around, you see Romney and Cotton just partnering on a new minimum wage bill. And so I think there are folks who are doing very serious work and therefore kind of have the energy by default. I mean, this is where there is good work being done, and fortunately, I think it aligns. Those types of folks are exactly the folks who have the potential to move things in the direction Jon is describing. And so I think life is going to go on. If Mona is not willing to support anyone with R next to their name until the sort of group apology has occurred, that's her prerogative. But the Republican Party and its leaders who are actually pushing for meaningful conservative reform are going to move ahead and try to do that.
I would vote for you, Mona. I just want you to know that if you decide to raise the banner.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, the only reforms that the Republicans are serious about these days, it seems, is trying to limit the voting rights of people to respond to a spurious problem, namely that there were serious voting irregularities in 2020, which there weren't. But I really don't see, I mean, yeah, Oren's right. There have been a few good things that have happened. But the energy, well, at the grassroots, the things that excite the Republican base, as I think, Oren, you would agree, are not the policy ideas. They like the cruelty, they like the show, they like the norm smashing, that Donald Trump has done. And apparently they are ready to believe every lie with a great enthusiasm. And so we have a lot of reparative work to do. We can't really just sit around and say, well, let's think about great policy proposals that Mitt Romney or Marco Rubio might come up with. You have to deal with the problem of a base that has been so badly misled and lied to. There has to be some deprogramming before we can begin to talk about normal politics again.
On deprogramming, Oren and Jon?
Yeah, I do want to caution folks. I think that one of the biggest tragedies of modern American social life in general is the shrinking ground that lies for a clear kind of foundation for the belief in human redemption, and the absence of recognition of the fact that in our increasingly secular age, and this has consequences for left and right, regardless of your religion, that we are all fallible and susceptible to being pulled by the sort of lower parts of our nature. It's possible for us all to be motivated by fear. We are all ignorant in various different ways. Our fear and ignorance has consequences for our behavior, and they can lead us to support things and people that don't represent the best in either who we are or what we could be. But when we talk about the American people, whichever camp we're pointing at, we do need to be honest about our flaws as people and the flaws of, our neighbors and so forth, while also finding a way to articulate a pathway towards something better, right? And so I do take Oren's point, although I share Mona's desire to be truthful, and there's a great emphasis in American life today on truth and accountability. But truth and accountability has to be able to take hands with compassion and understanding, and a fair-minded social analysis that allows us to understand the roots of people's frustrations without placating or appeasing the lower impulses of our social natures. And so, as we fill out this project of understanding how we chart a course forward, I hope that we can keep that sort of grace in mind, if you will.
I know there's other questions. Oren, quickly, did you want to respond to Mona and Jon?
I think it's just important to look at things both from the perspective of Americans. I mean, the people that Mona is describing are my neighbors, your neighbors, and her neighbors, and the vast majority of them are good people. And whether they're just responding to polls in certain ways or this has sort of cut to the core of their identity, in either case, it's obviously a huge concern that I think we need to address, but I think we need to address it in an empathetic way that strives to acknowledge whatever it is that's leading them in that direction, rather than just sort of condemn them or, I guess I take issue with the kind of deprogram rhetoric, because I think it sort of kind of automatizes people. And then the one other thing I would just add is I think we also need to think about what it is we're actually asking of our leaders. I guess I have much greater empathy for the typical Republican politician who is trying to navigate this situation. And I think it's very easy to say, well, just stand up and tell the truth and condemn everybody else. But if the result of that is just going to be tuned out, then that might not be a sufficient answer. And so I think there are a lot of also very good people in the leadership ranks who are genuinely trying to figure out how to navigate this situation in a constructive way. And I think it's hard. And I agree with much of what Mona has described about the seriousness of the challenges our democracy faces. I don't want to be heard to be minimizing any of that. I think the question is, how do we understand what is causing those things and what are the actual constructive responses to it? And that's where maybe we differ more.
The fellows, do we have time for one more question, or are we, or not?
Unfortunately, we have run out of time for
We've run out of
questions.
time. Okay.
Professor Shields, if you have a closing thought for us before I conclude.
No, why don't you go for it? I think I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. So on behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. A special thanks to Oren Cass, Mona Charen, John Wood Jr., and Professor Shields, and to all of those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be this Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific. Kelly Neff will speak to us on how we can reframe sex positivity in a socially isolated world. Thank you all and have a great evening.